A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Chris Borg, Policy Manager at NELC. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's event on the art of communication, navigating tough decisions. Firstly, I'd like to quickly run through a few housekeeping announcements, if that's okay, some of which are shown on the slide on the screen. Please do use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions to our speakers, and the chat function to interact with your fellow delegates and to share any information and links. If you require any technical support at all, please do post in the chat and my NELC colleagues will try their best to help. The closed caption feature, i.e. subtitles, can be accessed by all attendees at any time during today's event. So for desktop, laptop users, to turn on closed captions, please select Show Captions. The button will be labeled CC. And if the button isn't visible, please select the three dots on the bottom right corner of the screen. Then please select Captions. After that, you'll be prompted to click Show Captions, so please select this option. And if you're using a mobile device or tablet, please scroll across the menu on the bottom of your screen and select Captions. Well, you'll then need to click Show Captions. Once the captions are on, you can access a live transcription of the event. And if you have any selected the closed caption feature, please then use the reactions feature, which is the next button on the right of the closed caption feature by ticking the yes button, a green emoji with a tick, to show us that all the captions are working well at your end. So again, if you're experiencing any technical difficulties over the next hour and a quarter, please contact NELC support via the chat and we'll try and help you and rectify the issue. After the event, we'll send the presentation slides used today. Both sets of speakers are using slide decks, the chat and any other useful information. We'll also be inviting your feedback on today's event, so please do look out for the feedback form, which should pop up on your screens following the conclusion of the webinar. All delegates will be muted on entry to the Zoom webinar platform. Next slide, please, Liv. So NELC would like to thank its partners, Clear, CCLA and Blasure Eliminations, for their extensive support for today's NELC online event. And let's move on to today's event itself and what it's about. So the art of communication. Local parish and town councils face unprecedented demands and pressures, requiring increasingly complex decisions and expanded responsibilities. That's no less true now that LGR is local government reorganisation is kind of happening across the sector. And in this challenging environment, having robust communication skills is more crucial than ever. Today's event will transform your understanding of council communication, highlighting how effective engagement with residents can ease the impact of difficult decisions and indeed to an extent involve them in it. Attendees will gain today redefined communication strategies to help manage and improve resident interactions, learn actionable tips and best practices for enhancing communication with the community, and hear from communication experts, all three of them here today, specialising in local government. So without further ado, that's enough from me. I'll be thrilled today to be joined by a brilliant panel of speakers, Daniel Purchase, Director at Breakthrough Communications, and Polly Innes, Communications and Community Engagement Officer, and Sharon Groth, Chief Executive at Witney Town Council in Oxfordshire. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Daniel to introduce with his slide deck. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Chris, and hello to everybody attending today and watching the recording. First slide, please, Liv. So I want to talk for a few minutes around how communicating before, during, and after challenging situations can actually aid transparency and boost trust. Before we do that, just by way of introductions, we're privileged to be NELC's partner for both community engagement and communications, as well as separately for information compliance, GDPR and FOI. One of the things we do is give advice to councils on communications challenges, as well as helping councils really think about how they can maximise the opportunity that effective engagement presents. And I want, before I start to talk about tough decisions, I want to really go back to a couple of first principles here and a couple of questions I'm going to pose to you that I'd like you to sort of reflect on, take away, and perhaps take back to your council. My first question that I'd like you to reflect on and take away is, do you have a communication strategy as a council? Now, when I say strategy, I don't mean policy, at least not policy in isolation. An effective strategy is a guiding light. It is usually a written document agreed and adopted by council that provides the council as a body with a clear framework, map, journey, guide on how it can effectively engage with its community. Because what we often find with all the councils we work with, big and small, up and across England, is understandably councils get caught up in the here and now and in timely communications. We've got, Christmas, winter events coming up. We've got budget consultations, and there's kind of a lot going on. And actually, councils have amazing good news stories to tell. What we find, I'm generalising a little bit, but what we do find is councils often think a little less around, well, regardless of whether it's the end of November 2025 or 6 months down the line, what things do we want to communicate at any point in the year? And who do we want to communicate them to? And how do we do that job? And that is essentially the function of a good communication strategy. It also helps you identify risk and mitigate risk, pressure points as well. Essentially, it sets out the who, the what, the why, the where, the how, because beyond wanting to communicate with all residents all of the time, there will be times when a parish or town or community council wants to engage with specific demographic groups or geographic groups within its community or stakeholder groups, for example. Next slide, please, Lou. The second first principle question I want to ask is, well, do we have clarity as a council as to both what we're saying and how we're saying it? If I was to ask you to sort of write down on a post-it note, and I'm saying post-it note very much on purpose because there isn't a lot of space on a post-it note, what's the overarching message that you want the community to know, feel, or even think about your council? Because you may deliver lots of services, you may have lots of assets, but fundamentally, what is the takeaway message you want people to remember about you? Because when we have clarity of message, and that's what's called our evergreen message that sits alongside all of the timely things we do, we can then think through actually, in the context of the resources available to our council, how can we get those messages out and how can we seek feedback and listen? As a general point, I would make, regardless of whether we are a really small rural council with perhaps a part-time clerk and no other officer capacity, or perhaps at the other end of the scale, we are a super council with a multi-officer team, or anywhere on that scale, it's important to take a a resource appropriate mixed base approach to the channels that we have. We can't go all digital, but we can't go all analog either. It's about having a mix and finding a way to repeat our messages in different channels in different ways, because perhaps the way we might say something on a social media post will change compared to if we're putting up, say, a great big banner on railings in the high street or putting out a press release, for example. And the final point on this slide is how often, again, a question to reflect on our council, how often do we give residents the opportunity to proactively engage with us back? Next slide, please. So moving on from those first principles, I'm going to say something that I suspect everyone on this webinar would agree with, that communicating and engaging is fundamentally a good thing to boost transparency, build trust, and actually it can reduce not negate the risk, but it can reduce the risk of negative engagement taking hold. We need to think about what do we have coming up in the next year that we already know about that might be controversial? What is, for example, already being considered as part of our budget setting process for the next financial year that we think, well, actually, we need to think now about how we're doing that. Next slide, please. We're working with a number of councils who are either going through or who are about to go through LGR. And as part of that process of thinking about local government reorganisation, there are a number of councils I'm really delighted to see are thinking proactively and preemptively about that as something that's going to cause confusion in their community as to where responsibility sits for different services. Some councils are even going further and testing appetite now for asset transfer, for example. If we think about something that everyone's got coming up, your budget, what expectations could we set before the final decisions around your own council budgets are set? For example, because if we only communicate once a decision is taken, which we can't always avoid, I grant you, we are more likely to face a difficult engagement environment. Next slide, please. This all links to the power and the importance of building trust with our community. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from everything I'm saying, you can almost forget everything else, but take away this one message. Can we, or rather, how can we in 2026 move our communication outputs as a council from being transactional in nature to be all about building a relationship with the community that we serve? You're going to hear some great things shortly from the team at Whitney. And I know they're awesome and they do some great stuff in Whitney. But there are lots of councils like Whitney seeking now to build trust so that if, or frankly, when problems arise with communication, particularly something that is outside of your control, you're more likely to still have a more positive environment in which to communicate. So, next slide, please. Let's think about, therefore, how we prepare for difficult decisions. I said some of the time we might be aware of these, other times it might be very almost instant. What is important, whether we can do things preemptively and proactively, or frankly, whether we just have to react to a situation we find ourselves in, what's really important is to demonstrate as transparently as possible what was considered and why. Not just the outcome, but the journey, the process, and make that as accessible as possible. Because there'll always be somebody in a Facebook group, I'm picking on Facebook a bit here, there'll always be someone in a Facebook group that says, why can't the council just do insert name of really seemingly simple solution that definitely isn't viable? And we know it's not viable, but we have to explain so far as possible why. Next slide, please. Which links to the language that we use. As a former counsellor myself, I know I'm as guilty as anyone as using jargon and technical language that sometimes is not readily accessible to our communities. Now, we cannot turn every complex policy issue into a 5-word slogan. We all know the real world doesn't work like that. But what does the thing we have to communicate mean to somebody with no prior knowledge or understanding? That is kind of a fundamental question we need to be able to consider for any issue, whether it's a big decision the council's making or whether it is more of a crisis communication situation. I'm not going to name them, but I can see a couple of councils here with us today who in the last week have faced challenges outside of their control, not of their making, where they've had to react. What does it mean in the real world? What is the why behind a decision? These are some of the things we can think about to make it easier to get across our council's message. But of course, I recognise that no matter how much we do preemptively and proactively, sometimes things just will go wrong. Next slide, please. The first thing in any moment of crisis communication is to take a breath, actually, because if we don't stop for a moment to breathe and just have a think about the best way, the most appropriate way to respond, we're potentially going to cause ourselves more problems later on. Now, sometimes this can be because, let's say the council has made a very controversial decision, or it could be something where the council is being unfairly blamed for something that is actually not its responsibility whatsoever. That's something we see a lot. In any event, There may be times when we need to acknowledge and own the decision. There may be separate times where we might need to apologize or say sorry. Those are very niche, very specific circumstances. Quite often, though, we need to signpost and make it clear, actually, it's this authority over here, or it's this issue over here. In any event, working out, and also we need to consider, is it just one or two people shouting from the rooftops really loudly, or is there a genuine swell of challenge? I was at a conference in the southeast of England 2 weeks ago where a deputy clerk said to me, "We've got someone on Facebook in a Facebook group who is continually shouting about the town council over a very emotive, controversial issue." And when we had a long conversation afterwards, we tried to understand, well, are they just shouting, or is there genuine concern in the community? And when we explored it deeply, we realised it was just the voice of one person. And from digging into it further, we could genuinely see most people weren't even aware of the issue. So there is a danger sometimes in overreacting to an issue, as well as underreacting and not acknowledging or explaining in human language. So my key message here is we need to consider the best response and what to do. Finally, I want to make you aware of something that's been the case for quite a while now, but don't suffer in silence, especially if it's in a moment of genuine crisis communication. Next slide, please, Liv. Um, we've Sorry, no, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Sorry. Before I tell you how you can get help with a moment of crisis, three sort of things I would use to sum up what I've tried to say in my messages to you today: clarity, confidence, and consistency. We need to break down and set aside any jargon, anything that isn't directly relevant to the issue we're trying to communicate, and get real clarity on what is the issue we need to communicate, why does it matter from the perspective of a resident or whichever stakeholder group we are talking about, how is it impacting them through their lens, through their eyes, not what the council thinks. We can also, that's going to help us really think about how to communicate this better. What's really important, and with a lot of communication challenges, it's about having confidence to communicate preemptively, proactively, wherever possible. We can't always, especially if it's a moment of unexpected crisis, but there's a lot we can prepare for. And really consider, what is your council's message? What is your story that you want to tell to preempt negative engagement later on? Budget time, as in your council's budget, is a really good topical forthcoming example of that. And lastly, it's about consistency. If we have something to say, don't just say it once. It's really important to build what's called stickability, that you repeat your message and turn it into a narrative, a story, to the point where people are almost repeating it back to you. And then finally, on my last slide, uh, so at Breakthrough, we work with councils across the country, and I can see some of our customers are here today, but actually we also have a free support service you can access to, which is actually run in partnership with both NALC as well as county associations across England. And the simple message is we have an advisory service that where you are referred by your county association, so you can't just come to us directly, they have to refer you. You can get support for your council up to twice a year, free of charge, on any information compliance on the one hand, but more importantly for today, community engagement or crisis communication situation. To access that, simply speak to your county association. The very final thing from me, we are keen always to understand what are the pain points that councils have around comms. So I'm just going to put a message in the chat window, which I hope comes through. That is asking you, if this is entirely optional, I should make this very clear. At Breakthrough, we've launched a national survey to understand councils' pain points around comms and engagement. We're going to share our findings nationally to try and help councils think about how they can improve their approach to community engagement. So if you have a few minutes at some point, we'd love your feedback. It's not about the challenges and opportunities your council has. Chris, I'm going to hand back to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so very much, Dan. Really thorough expose of what Breakthrough Comms' kind of mission is and how yourself and the organisation there can really make an impact and help parish and town councils across the country in England. That's fantastic. Thanks so much. And I know we'll hear more from you during the Q&A a bit later. So next up, and again, a decent window here for Polly and Sharon to speak on behalf of Witney Town Council and how I know they've worked a bit with Dan before in Breakthrough Comms, how they currently communicate and involve residents in their area in decision making and communicating with them on sometimes difficult decisions. I know Sharon is going to introduce Polly and say a few brief words herself at this point, and also participate in the questions. Over to yourself, Sharon.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Just a quick introduction. I've worked for Witney Town Council for 25 years now. 18 of those have been as town clerk, and Polly joined the team 16 years ago. So we've had quite a few crises over that period of time. If I mention the name David Cameron as being our MP for quite a long time, so we are a very, very political council and also a political town still. So we have had quite a few issues to deal with. And I think what Dan's said about confidence, I think we have grown in confidence as to how we approach some of these topics. But Polly is going to talk through a couple of those examples and the issues that we've had to encounter during that time. So away you go, Polly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Polly. I'm the Communication Officer at Witney Town Council. My job is never, ever boring. I work for an ambitious and very political and busy council that keeps their officers occupied and for the most part out of mischief. I never really have what you might call a typical day, and even my best planning is often discarded for something more urgent at a moment's notice. It's a good job. I like variety, and I have the sort of easily distracted brain that can refocus multiple times if necessary. That's not always a blessing. Today, I want to talk about how councils can deliver even bad news with honesty, integrity, and humanity, even when the stories are complicated, emotive, or even heartbreaking. And I want to share two examples with you. One relatively low impact piece of bad news involving a much loved cedar tree, and one involving something no council can ever really plan for. So next slide, please. So the cedar tree, we'll start with that. Now I'll admit I'm a bit of a tree hugger, so this came naturally for me to write about anyway. I tie ribbons on them and dance around them at various times of the year. I wassail in orchards in the winter and sing to the apple trees to wake them from their winter sleep. I genuinely love our green spaces. And it's my ambition one day to be the most polished and accomplished communication officer who can spin a press release as gracefully as she circles a solstice bonfire. Anyway, when we had to announce that an ancient, iconic cedar in the closed churchyard had to be felled, I knew we had to handle it with real care. This wasn't just a tree, it was a landmark tree, part of the church's identity. It had certainly been around longer than we had and probably had more followers than us on Facebook. So we could have just issued a very dry statement about structural surveys, fungal decay, and risk assessments. But instead, we researched the history, the folklore, and the cultural significance of the tree. We acknowledged people's attachments to it, including my own. We wrote with warmth and the slightest hint of sentimentality. And then the church told us something wonderful. They planned to reuse some of the timber to create a new altar. Suddenly, this wasn't a story just of loss, but of transformation. It was a long time coming. We had no updates. But when the promise became a reality 3 years later, the community remembered that we had told them the truth and told it with heart. We had some great comments. Now imagine that, people praising a council statement, a rare moment. Next slide, please. I think I know why that story worked. The cedar tree did teach us some important lessons. One, be clear and consistent. Your truth has to outlast the initial noise your story may generate. Two, explain the reasons, even the unglamorous ones. People do want the detail. The comments say exactly that. We preempted a lot of the objections people might have to such a beautiful old tree being cut down with irrefutable facts and the knowledge that this was from a position of last resort. We have it, having tried everything else that we could. Acknowledge feelings. People aren't robots, and neither are we, and it's good for everyone to acknowledge that. Sometimes the decisions we make are not popular with everyone, but that doesn't mean that we don't care about the same things. Offer hope when possible. Transformation and replacement, not just loss. And keep it human. A touch of humour never hurts. Simple principles, right? Well, then came a story that was anything but simple. Next slide, please. There are some communications you can prepare for and some that you simply can't. When we first heard reports that a young teenage girl had drowned in our lake, the atmosphere changed instantly. There was no handbook for this, no prepared statement, just shock. It happened on a hot Sunday in July. As information slowly came through, we had to act, but carefully. We had to acknowledge that something terribly sad had happened, yet we couldn't release details that were unverified or sensitive. There was no room for speculation and no possibility of anything official until the investigation was complete. And that was going to be some time. That was going to be weeks later. So we did the only thing that was right. We sat tight, hard as it was. We worked with our mayor to issue an initial statement expressing sorrow and solidarity without overstepping what we were permitted to say. It was the most responsible route, but it felt painfully counterintuitive because everyone, and most especially the family, were desperate for answers we simply couldn't give. Journalists contacted us constantly. Residents asked for more detail. Rumours swirled. Senior officers met with the girls' parents. They were grieving, heartbroken, and understandably angry. They were trying to cope with the unimaginable. And all we could do, professionally, ethically, humanly, was respect the grieving process and privacy of the family and refer everyone else back to that one carefully worded early statement. We still had to maintain total public silence, and that silence could have been perceived as uncaring. It was one of the hardest things we've ever had to do. And of course, the rest of the council business didn't stop. We still had to put out other news updates, but we also needed a respectful pause before even attempting to share anything remotely positive. Timing became an act of judgment, compassion, and restraint. Next slide, please. So what we took from this, what these moments taught us, were that difficult stories, whether they involve loss, anger, money, or community conflict, show us something important. There is no news that matters more to your residents than local news. We see it in the viewing figures, the comments, the engagement. People care deeply about what is happening where they live. And because they care, how we communicate matters that much more. So even when we are posting positive news, there are people who will hijack your post to talk about the things that bother them: a lack of St. George's flags around the town, too many small boats, an asylum hotel on our doorstep. Or they will question the value of spending all that money on young people when we could simply be fixing potholes. There is value in occasionally turning off comments to prevent this. It's not something we do lightly, but sometimes when feelings are running high about something else in national news, and we want to eliminate that distraction from a particularly important or relevant piece of local news, this can be a good strategy. And sometimes if we're consulting, it's not helpful for people to put their consultation responses in the comments. So we might do it for that too. In the same way, we do not reply to comments on social media. We have a little disclaimer at the top of the page that says our page is for information only, and any questions that require an answer should be submitted on the info address so that we can deal with it properly and fully. And in this way, we do not get caught up in endless online skirmishes, and people don't expect an instant response. Where we allow comments, they're automatically hidden if they have certain keywords in them so that nothing offensive will appear out of office hours or overnight. So not only are you up against the usual suspects on your local spotted page, there's also sometimes a little bit of political football going on. Rather than simply sharing our nice factual posts, it gets rebadged, sometimes retold, so that one party or another can lay claim to the glory. This is our councillors at work. Doing what they can to promote themselves is understandable, but it can lead to confusion about our branding and who we are. Next slide, please. So who do we think we are? We do have to remind our audience regularly about who we are and what we do. And we have a handy little tool for this, which you're looking at now. We post our wheel of services probably every 6 weeks, over and over again, to drum home that one message about who we are and what we do. And then we get maybe one person that will say, oh, so you don't actually do potholes, or oh, that's really useful, thank you so much. And that's a small win, just one person maybe, but it's a gain and a win, and we'll take it. Identifying ourselves as the most local council in this way, separating us from the bigger, more faceless councils, reminding people that many of us live and work in the town alongside them. We are their neighbours. That's another way that we can gain a little more trust. So we strive to communicate with honesty, integrity, and humanity. We try to be ready and truthful and sincere. And who knows, just maybe, if we keep doing that, one day somebody might say something nice about us on Facebook. Stranger things have happened. So whether it is a precept increase, which is always fun, or whether it's a tragedy that shakes the whole community, the rules remain the same. Tell the truth. Be steady. Be compassionate. Be consistent. And when the story is painful, let humanity guide the tone. Because ultimately, trust is built in these moments, the good ones, the difficult ones, and the ones that leave you staring at your keyboard, wondering how to say something that feels impossible to say. And trust is what we need to help us deliver all aspects of our news to a receptive audience. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Polly and Sharon. That's brilliant and demonstrates, as I'm sure Dan would agree, absolutely fantastic way that you've dealt with and communicated with residents around some of the really tricky and difficult issues over the last few years, and over many years, by the sounds of it, that you've both been at the council there. You've run the real gamut of experiences and done a fantastic job in building a relationship with your residents in the way that Dan enunciated. So what we're going to do now is move on. We've got probably an extra 10 minutes for this, actually, or so, is to start a round of questions from the Q&A box. I noticed that some of you have been using the chat. That's brilliant. We haven't had many Q&As, probably because, like me, been avidly listening to what Dan, Polly and Sharon have been saying in the Q&A box. But if you do have any questions, we strongly encourage you to please put them to the panel in the Q&A box there. And please do continue to put your questions in there. If you could try to keep them, please, short and sweet, and make sure they are questions and not statements. That help me as we filter through them. You can upvote them as well. So if you really like a question that you see, give it the thumbs up, and then we'll try to ask the most popular questions. Try to keep it general for all of the panel to be able to ask or answer the same question, and we'll try and get through as many as possible before 1:05. So looking in there at the moment, we're starting to receive some of these in. Thanks, Sarah Beale, for being really proactive and helping ask some questions here. So I think what we'll do, Sarah, is ask one of your questions here. So Dan, we'll put this one to you, which I think is a second of one of Sarah's posts. Do any councils that you know of have a well-being policy or something similar? Second part of the question is, how does a council protect councillors who are volunteers from the backlash of kind of the well-known activities of keyboard warriors? It's a kind of double-edged question. Dan, I'll ask that to you first.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not specifically aware of councils that have wellbeing policies in relation to what we're talking about today, but colleagues at Whitney might. What we do see is, and I mentioned the issue the gap sometimes, a bit of a chasm between strategy, in other words, approach to comms, and policy. What we sometimes find is councils have either a single overarching policy for everything regarding comms, or they might have a multitude, for example, a social media policy, a press policy, a councillor's communication policy, and other things too. On the more general point around councillors, I think there's a couple of issues there, and Sarah, I agree with you about helping to protect councillors as well. I would add, as helping to inform councillors about getting them to think about how they communicate too. So a few things I'd say on that. First of all, it's important that councillors understand their role in community engagement. It's important, so far as is humanly possible, that council speak as a voice, as a body, as a voice. And when Sharon and Polly communicate as Witney Town Council, they are communicating as that body of people with official decisions made, etc., or official lines on issues. There are councillors who choose to be very proactive, especially on social media themselves. I'm not going to jump down that particular rabbit hole for the purpose of this session, but if they do that, what they need to be aware of and understand is anything a councillor says, especially on social media, will generally be assumed to be official council policy, even if it isn't. So they have to remind themselves of that. I think also they're reminding councillors, going back to your point about protecting them, creating some clear blue water between their private life and their, particularly on social media, and their role as a councillor is healthy. Also, it's often not their job to respond. It may be the job of the council as a body to respond, if at all. But also, because we're all human, not responding in anger. We've all seen stuff where there's misinformation, and as a councillor, I might feel, well, but that's just plain wrong, and I know the answer, and I'm going to engage in this debate right now. And if it's 10 o'clock on a Friday night, I'm not sure that's always the healthiest thing to do. So taking a step back, I would add, um, as well. And I can see a comment in the chat about an example of a wellbeing policy in Launceston. So thank you for that. That's my thought on that issue, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Dan. You have quite a few good questions being posted here, so we'll try to get through these fairly quickly. So Sharon and Polly, don't know which one of you wants to take this question. The same question that Dan has answered. Do any councils? Does Witney Town Council, I guess, have a wellbeing policy or something similar? And I guess, have you ever encountered an issue where councillors who are volunteers, in our sector, need to be protected from keyboard warriors? I mean, I guess from your own experiences.
Okay, I'll answer that one. Certainly, we do have a wellbeing policy. We have social media policy, and we do try to protect our staff as well as councillors. So we try to sort of set out the expectations, and I think quite a few of us have been on the receiving end of, oh, you're a council officer, and we get approaches on social media too. So that sort of counter argument is also quite difficult to navigate. As far as the councillors and protecting them, I mean, I think a lot of our younger councillors are quite proactive on social media channels, and they're quite keen. They'll sit in a meeting and hear a decision, and they're straight onto their social media to sort of communicate that to the residents, which is all very well. But like Dan said, is sometimes you need to have that official council line on some of the more sensitive issues there. So it is trying to get a balance, and I know the keyboard warriors is a big issue for us in Witney. And it is quite difficult to navigate on such sites as Spotted Witney, especially as one of our Spotted Witney pages unofficially is led by one of our town councillors, both in his personal and council Facebook profile. So, sometimes messages it kind of confuses what's fact and fiction, or what is the council line. So we do our best, but it's quite difficult to navigate, I think, with those keyboard warriors.
Absolutely, no, fantastic. Thanks very much, and that's a really holistic, really good answer. Polly, I don't know if you had anything just brief to add into what Sharon said, and then we can move on to the next questions. No, I don't know whether.
Sorry,
I don't know whether.
I'm there now. Sorry, I think Sharon's covered it. We do also offer training to counsellors for social media, which they don't usually take up, but it is there. It is an offer. It is there to try and protect them, and they tend to sort of respond sometimes that they feel they're being a bit gagged if we're advising them against taking certain paths. So we do now tend to leave them to it, but we're still here to support them at the end of the day. So.
No, fantastic. That's great. And it really complements Sharon's answer brilliantly. Thanks very much indeed for that. So there's another question here, which is from Rebecca Pierce, which I think, Dan, is probably a good one for yourself. You mentioned communication strategies in your slide deck earlier on. Where would you begin when crafting a communication strategy, if you're doing it for the first time and your council hasn't previously had one? I guess it probably wouldn't be as onerous as doing a neighbourhood plan, but, first principles, Dan.
Absolutely. And the one thing I would say is I'm not sure whereabouts in the country we are, Rebecca, but we run comm strategy training in partnership with most of the county associations. So you might want to look at that just as a side note. As a general point, we think about actually, well, what are we trying to achieve? What would we want good to look and feel like for our council, and how are we going to work it? So in lots of the councils we work with on creating a comms strategy, there's usually a comms working group or similar, or some councillors who have more of an interest than others in anything to do with comms. It needs to be an officer-led process because we're talking about how the council communicates as a body, not about individual councillors. But what is important in my experience is getting councillors and officers together in a space to explore, well, what does good look like? So this is not a council meeting agenda item. It needs to be a conversation. We call it a workshop, where we can explore, well, actually, what does good look like? Beyond all residents, who are the people and the groups we want to be able to get our message in front of? What are the resources that we have? In other words, can we do lots and lots, or do we need to be really careful and selective about the methods we use? What is our message? So it's really thinking through, Rebecca, the kind of the who, the what, the why, the where, the how. That will link up then better with any existing policies you have, or get you to think about any policy gaps as well. But essentially, it's a conversation as a starting point around the who, the what, the why, the where, the how. What does good look like for your parish or town council? What do you want to say? Who are you trying to say it to?
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. That's really, helpful expose there. And the same question, I guess, to yourself, Sharon. Where would you begin, or where did you begin? May the question be asked of Whitney when crafting, communication strategy. Do you remember a time when your council perhaps didn't have one, or didn't in fact have a social media policy, which I know is a bit different? Any tips for Rebecca?
Well, I will hand over to Polly, actually, because she's just refreshed our communication strategy. So she might be able to give you some pointers on a sort of fresh, hot off the press with that one.
Great, thanks.
Hi, yeah. So this was how I spent my time during COVID when I wasn't in the office. It was a great time to actually sit down and write the communication strategy that we were looking to have. So what I did first of all was I looked at a couple of other council strategies to see what they had, what they contained in them, what were the main things that we were looking to have in ours. And then it was basically, what do we do now, currently, what are we doing? What do we want to do? And who do we want to do that with? So and we've also got alongside that, we've also got a community engagement strategy, but they are very, very similar. So we wrote our first communication strategy in 2021. It was reviewed a couple of times. Actually, within a year, we'd achieved all our actions from that. So that was really pleasing. So I've just reviewed it, just put some new actions in. We've realised we've got a big demographic that we're not hitting with our communications because they're not people that would use Facebook or even necessarily Instagram. So where do we go and find them? How do we reach those? And the conclusion is that we've probably got to visit a few pubs to reach those people. terrible hardship, but someone's got to do it. So we'll find a way.
Fantastic. No, that's really, really helpful and gives you a practical kind of coalface experience as to what, a council has to do when refreshing one as well. It really is a bit down like the neighbourhood planning process, isn't it? Because neighbourhood plans also need to be refreshed. So you do a thing once and then you re-engage and then you update it, refresh it. No, exactly. Listen, that's brilliant. Thank you all for your answers on that. Gonna move now to a question from Marilyn Tai, who asks quite a good general question. Dan, you alluded to this in your slide deck. Ask you first. So, would you recommend a parish council have its own Facebook site? I don't want to put you on the spot there. I do know that some councils, for example, down in Cornwall, did use Facebook. For example, we did an event on this recently to promote to candidates for standing election in May 25 for their elections. So we know it's been used by some councils around the country for things like that. But if it's not an appropriate question to ask, Dan, say so. But any tips?
Yeah, can I offer a couple of general comments on how council should use social media, take it to a slightly higher level than Facebook for a moment, then I'll come back to Facebook in a second.
Yeah.
So social media is an interesting one because I respect the fact that within any council there will be people, some staff, some councillors who never want to use social media themselves, and because we all have communication preferences. What we have to acknowledge is whatever we personally think about social media and its pros and cons, its benefits and risks. Statistically speaking, I saw a data set from February this year. Over 7.5 out of 10 people in the United Kingdom actively use at least one social media platform for over an hour every day. There are massive demographic differences within that, but fundamentally, what is statistically valid is that a majority of residents are on it. Therefore, a parish of any size should have an official presence, in my view, on one or more social channels. It then comes back to scale, though, because in a larger council like the team here from Witney, they will be on more than one social platform. Facebook is just about, but only just about, still the biggest platform in the United Kingdom context. It is the grandparent of social media. It's been around since 2005, and what we need to do is ensure that Facebook is still a good place to start. And yes, to directly answer the question from Marilyn, I think that council should have, at the very least, an official Facebook presence. In Facebook parlance, that's a page that is the official voice of the council. And if a council were to say, well, there's so many other social platforms, what's the secondary one that we should consider? It's probably Instagram, simply because it connects to Facebook really well. There are other platforms that can be useful, like LinkedIn. We could start naming platforms at this point. It goes back to the more fundamental question: what does your council want to achieve with its communication strategy, and how will any social media platform help you do that? Will be my starting point.
Fantastic, Dan. That's really, really helpful because it does nod to social media more widely, doesn't it? And NELC will be looking to organise a social media online event like this next financial year for anyone interested in more of a deeper dive into social media, which is, as you say, a bit different to the wider comms approach. So, Sharon, again, or Polly, whoever, but Sharon initially. Would you recommend the parish council have its own Facebook site? I assume that Witney Town Council has had or has a Facebook site.
We do, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's quite a major tool for us to engage with our community. I think we've struggled. We always get the same people cropping up at the annual town meeting saying, "Oh, I didn't hear this meeting was on." Well, why are you here then? So it's kind of that balance of how we communicate with all our residents, what suits them. And I think it's something we've done a big piece of work around more recently, trying to make sure we reach out to not everyone, but we still do paper newsletters, we do online newsletters, but we do use Facebook probably as our primary social media account linked with the Instagram. But Polly can probably tell you about the delights of TikTok and all that, those other things that are way beyond me, as I'm a bit of an oldie, like Facebook instead.
Not the case at all on the latter point, Sharon. And if that applies to you, that certainly applies to me. Yeah, Polly, any additional points, perhaps writ large, on the social media front now?
Yeah, we try and cover off as much as we can now. I do have a little team of people now, which makes a lot of difference when you're not trying to do it all on your own. So you can expand a little bit more than that. So a parish clerk on their own is probably going to struggle with more than just having Facebook. But you could have Facebook and Instagram, because actually you can post to both of those using a meta tool within Facebook. There's a little hidden tool that you use, and you write the post and it shares it to both those platforms. So then you can get your younger people and your older people, and you can differentiate the text that's in them. So slightly longer posts on Facebook, shorter, snappier ones on Instagram. So I recommend, if you get Facebook, you get Instagram as well. You may as well. It's not going to cause you any more work. And yeah, we've also got TikTok, which we're still building on that one. We've got a website which we maintain. That's always got the longer full stories on. We've got YouTube, so we can use that to do things on. And we've got LinkedIn as well. So we've got 6 platforms that we regularly use. But we don't do them all with every item of news, because some of them just aren't appropriate for some things. So
yeah, it sounds like from what you're all saying, is that it's horses for courses, really, depending on the audience, how you want to segue and who you want to communicate with. That's a good idea to have that kind of menu of different tools to use. Thanks all for that. Drilling down into one of those groups. So Carly Fox has helpfully asked an interesting question here, which might potentially take us off piste a little bit, but it's a very good question. And it's, do you have any tips on how to engage younger members of the community? Now, at this point, I'll make an unrepentant, plug for NALC's youth online event, which started this week, properly kind of organising, which takes place, I believe, at the end of February. So anyone who's interested in either encouraging young people to stand for election of councillors in future, or hearing about kind of youth councils, or just engaging generally young people in your area, you might want to think about booking onto that event. It's on our website. But again, Dan, any work you've done with councils, your customers, whatever, generally about specifically, whether it's through a specific social media platform or otherwise, engaging with that kind of cohort?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll offer a few thoughts, if I may, on youth engagement. The first thing is going to sound like a very obvious thing to say, but we need to be really clear on what we mean by the term young person. Because when we run training on youth engagement through our county association partners, that's actually the first question we ask, and quite understandably, we get a range of answers from people who are at school, of school age, people who are sort of in their teens, possibly even people in young professionals and families in their early 20s and even 30s, because we need to answer that question first in order to work out, well, if we have a message we want to get in front of a particular youth demographic, or we want to hear from them, where do we find them? And we can only answer that by answering the first question first. A couple of things I would say generally when we do have clarity on that first point: where are they, and how do we find them? Social media, probably more than any other channel, plays a really important part here of both reaching and hearing from younger demographics, particularly platforms like Instagram, like TikTok, actually, to get a message in front in response to them. The other thing I would say, and I'm gonna mention an example, and then when I finish speaking, I'll put a link to the example in the chat, because it's actually from COVID, but it's still a very fabulous example. There is a council in West Sussex, Billingshurst, who during COVID carried out a consultation on a skate park, as many councils do. And the thing they did brilliantly was, rather than it just being members of the council doing a little post saying, look, please tell us what you think about these skate park options, they did peer-to-peer conversation. So it was a young person talking to young people in the community. They identified a young person through some connection to the council, and there is a short, less than 1 minute video on their Facebook site, which I will link to in the chat after this, where the video was a 1 minute video that's been watched almost 9,000 times. from a young person saying, look, the parish council are listening to you, tell them what you think about their ideas for a skate park. And the council received well over 400 responses to that consultation. That is just one example that springs to mind. So peer-to-peer with youth engagement can, if we can find a way to make it work, be good. Also, language and tonality. Again, this sounds obvious, but being really accessible with our language without being patronising, without talking down. Using video as a way to humanise the work of the council in order to get the message in front of the right audience, as well as what about communications partners who can amplify the council's message? So if the audience is relevant, schools and colleges, for example, youth-focused organisations, as well as getting advice from, NALC have some great resources on this as well, of course, as well. And there's I think there's the NALC Youth Younger Counsellors Network. So lots of resource and advice, but that's my thoughts on that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. And again, it's how you communicate with young people in a particular patch, isn't it, Dan? And I'm sure that councils different size, do use those different methods to engage with them. Sharon, any particular tips about how Witney Town Council has itself engaged with younger residents, or indeed encourage younger people to stand for election to the council, per se, in the past? Have you used social media? I guess Polly's partly covered it already, but any tips?
I was just going to say, Polly did allude to that we are going to go and spend the rest of the afternoon in the pub doing some youth engagement. Maybe not.
Fantastic. Entirely non-alcoholic, I'm sure. And no, that's a great answer. Thanks. So, Polly, did you want to elaborate or expand on your answer from before? I think Carly's defining younger people, perhaps also younger councillors maybe here, I don't know, as under 40. But I don't know, maybe that's a different definition to how you'd interpreted it in Witney.
I think our gap, that where we're not getting responses to surveys and things like that, is sort of age 20 to 30. That's the gap for us. That's the big hole in our demographic. So those are the people that we're looking to engage with. We've cracked the school one. So we do have a youth council currently that are newly set up. They're very different to the youth council we had previously. So there's been a COVID thing in between that has completely changed how they engage or don't engage, and the confidence that they have has all gone. It's a really weird thing to see that we had this very, very confident and active youth council previously, and the new guys just are so reserved. So that's quite an eye opener. But we discovered through that schools have a thing called morning slides, which is like what happens in assembly. So if we want to get a message to them, that's a really good way, is to just contact the school and say, can you include this in your morning slides? So we've sent surveys into school as well, which has sort of backfired on us slightly because it skewed all our results, because we're not used to hearing from them. So they will frequently skip things because they don't know what they are. They're not services that they've ever engaged with, so they can't comment on them. So that's kind of skewed our data a little bit. So we're going to look at doing a separate survey for them. But for now, we will continue to do that method. And in fact, one of our current councillors, one of the youngest ones of our current councillors, is a previous youth councillor. So that's a win, even if just one person goes for it. So, we're quite excited about having him, really, most of the time.
Fantastic. As Dan said, comms, needs to be human, I guess, and every one of us on the call today is, a human being. So have to bear that human factor in mind. So no, fantastic. Thanks for that great answer. Moving on to the end of the Q&A kind of slot here. 2 or 3 of the kind of people posting questions have done so on this topic, which is the wheel of services that was in your helpful slide deck, Polly. But NALC is collaborating with the Centre for Ageing Better, and they are hoping to publish, I think, even next week, a parish and town guide to help parish councils make their communities more age-friendly, for example. And they've used one of these for across the country, etc., to generally describe the services which counties, districts, and boroughs and parish and town councils kind of use. So they've put that together, but it looked very similar to the one you've used very, very well on Oxfordshire in your deck. But so I think visually it's an excellent way, but of course, of communicating what the different size of parish council, Dan, do. But equally, bearing in mind LGR, someone's posted in a comment about LGR. If we're moving to effectively two-tier areas with parishes and towns kind of working at the coalface and a one strategic authority above, that's probably going to have to be kind of a two-level wheel, isn't it? So I think in many areas from next year. Dan, any advice on is a wheel of services model a useful template, you think, for councils trying to communicate with residents who does what in their patch?
I think it's brilliant. I love what Polly's done. I got to see it a couple of months ago, and it's genuinely brilliant. I think from the work we do with councils around England, councils try and explain and communicate who they are and what they do and what they don't do, actually, which is often just as important. In quite varying ways. I think a wheel of services or any other kind of relevant infographic, because of course, as we said, with LGR, that's going to change things in some areas. Some areas are already two-tier anyway. The thing that's really important for me is those sort of visual storytelling devices, like a wheel of services, like an infographic, are fantastic as long as we use them in the way that Whitney do, which is to use them in a repeated way, in a consistent way. Um, Quite often we'll ask a clerk or an officer, how often do you as a council get criticised for things that aren't your fault? And we always use potholes as the sort of simplistic example. And yet how often don't you get credit for the great work you actually do and for the stuff that you are responsible for? So any visual device like that, brilliant. It needs to be consistent, because where it falls down is, if we look at social media as one channel here, if I look at a council social media output for say a month, I'd want to see that infographic repeated at appropriate times in order to get that message of stickability across, so that we're educating people actually as to who does what, but we have to continue the education. And that's where you have to think, well, how does that all sit in amongst all the other things we have to communicate? So I love what Whitney have done here. Any visual way to explain and build a story around what we do, what we don't do. And as one clerk in Hertfordshire once said to me, it's about providing all our residents with great customer service, whether it's something we do or something over here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dan. No, that's really helpful. It is an infographic, and it's also, I mean, to be honest, I've not seen too many of them within the sector, but it's certainly, if I was, either looking at this, to be published Centre for Aging Better Guide, or, wanting to know about what Whitney Town Council services were, for example, I think it's a really good way, at a glance of looking at who does what generally. Because very often there are people working in local government who just simply don't know, especially at the higher tiers, who does what anyway. But yeah, Sharon, any initial comments before we perhaps give way to Polly to add a bit more detail on how she put it together?
Sure. I think what we struggle with as well is dual-hatted members. So whilst it says in our inner circle what we do, because they're on the district or the county, they think we do it too. So it's not just an education for the residents. Sometimes it's also an education for councillors to sort of make them understand. But actually, we are, like you say, the face of the customer service and giving good customer service in your area. We often do take on queries for the district and the county, and we're able to sort of signpost residents, or will take on their query and sort of deal with it too. So we're not strict on who does what, but we just like to do good customer service, and make sure that our residents aren't having to go to 3 authorities to get an answer. We try to help them that way.
Yeah, when you think about it, actually, as well as what came out of what Dan's slide deck and Polly's before, as well as communicating with either things like precept increases, tragedy in the local community, really bad news, having to communicate really difficult decisions back to residents that the councils had to make. Who does what is probably, I'm guessing, the second kind of, or providing clarification to residents on who empties the bins, who do we pay our council tax to, what is it we get from Whitney Town Council, is probably the other half of the the whole comms coin, isn't it? Here, I'm imagining. But Polly, yeah, how did you put that together? What I'm just personally interested. What software did you use, or did you get a third party to put it together, or
We
how did that work?
just did it in Canva. So I think I tried to do something in Word before we had Canva, and it was just absolutely a nightmare. It just, and publisher wouldn't do it well either. So it was as soon as Canva came along and I could manage it easily, then we put it together. And it's literally we just looked on each council, each level of council's website to see what the services were, to make sure we'd included them all, and we've allowed for the fact that there's an overlap. So we cut some grass. OCC cut some grass, WODC cut some grass, so they've all got mowers on them, and then it's just little icons that are available in Canva. So there was no cost to us. Anyone's completely welcome to adopt it and adapt it to use for their own uses. And then my colleague added the little 3 boxes with the contact details for each of the councils on as a sort of secondary thing, and that's also been a really good thing, because it means we don't have to field all the calls then about everything. But it's not really hard to do. The reason for those colours was simply because we used to have an old map that came from our district council that had like land responsibility areas that was in those colours. So I just used those colours because it's that, and because they're also quite bright, quite striking. So people do look at it when they see it and wonder what it is, and also they're differentiated enough. They're not two very similar blues or greens or whatever. So it's again, there's a lot of contrast in there.
Yeah, I'm guessing that it's something similar to what the design team at Centre for Ageing Better are using or used, because it looks very similar. But absolutely fantastic, and I agree, with Dan that it's more of a, to be used as an ongoing blended tool to just let people know who does what, because people move into areas, they move out of areas. Some are parish, some aren't. Some are 2-tier, some are 3-tier. It must be very, very difficult. But actually, if it's saving you, reducing phone calls coming into the council, then it's got to be a win, hasn't it? Listen, fantastic. We've got 8 minutes of the event left. There aren't any more questions that I can see that we can necessarily ask now. But what I'm going to do is just move to what we discussed before the event started, guys, and is just ask you to sum up, really, each of you, by providing one thing you think, in your view, that parish and town councils can start doing straight away to communicate better with their residents. So that's just one thing, perhaps based on what you've already said, or generally want to sum up in the last few minutes. Over to you, Dan, first.
Thank you. So a couple of final thoughts from me. I think really consider the why behind the decisions we make and how we explain them, even the small ones. Even a sort of single sentence of sort of context saying why something is happening, what is influencing it, etc., can reduce confusion, can stop rumours from setting in, and can ultimately build trust. And I'll add a second, if I may, which is really give thought to, in 2026, can we move from our communications and outputs being reactive and just of a timely nature to more of a thoughtful, strategic nature? Because if we can do that, we're likely to reduce the risk of negative engagement, either when we have something controversial to announce, or if there's something unexpected, and as I said, that moment of crisis. And finally, you're not alone. Get support early. Again, the advisory service is free for you as well.
Fantastic, Dan. Brilliant summary there. Sharon, based on your extensive experience at Whitney, as we said before, you've seen several different kind of, positive and negative kind of, experiences communicating with residents there. What's the one thing you would take from that length of time, at the town council as to how others at different sizes of parish council can communicate with the residents?
I think it is giving that honest press release, sort of writing down what you need to say, and perhaps not flanneling it up in a way that people are reading between the lines. I think you've got to be true to what you're actually trying to say, and making people understand about the actions you're taking, or the implications that have happened as a result, why we're reporting that. But it is that honesty, I think, that's come through from both Dan and Polly's presentations today, is that sort of truthfulness with your audience and your residents.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. Being true to the council and the council's culture, as you said, the message you're trying to get out, which bleeds on to what Dan said. Polly, obviously done a fantastic job there at the town council. The one thing that you would, as comms officer there, advise councils of different size, probably on a principle to take away that they can try and implement.
Some branding and use it on everything so that it's very clear who's telling this story. So, just your logo on absolutely everything, or your crest, or whatever you're using, but just make sure that everybody knows that story is coming from you, and it's a truthful story, and there's no fake news here. It's blatantly honest, brutally honest if it has to be, but just honest and truthful and clear every single time.
No, that's fantastic, and that definitely overlaps with what Dan and Sharon have both said. So I'm taking away from this, timely and strategic communications, clear communications with different groups of residents, using different tools. Be truthful to what you're trying to communicate, and clear. And obviously, as you say, being mindful of the different timeliness of different communications, and when generic strategic ones can go out, as Dan has described, and using the advisory service and help when it's needed. There's an open door there, as Dan has rightly said. That's absolutely brilliant. Well, it's 11 minutes past, so I've managed somehow to take us to 1 minute over the time we had allocated for questions. I can't seem to quite get it right. But moving on to the final slide, Liv, for future events. Just to also then say as well, as you'd expect me to, a huge thanks to all of our brilliant speakers today, Dan, Polly and Sharon, for their brilliant and insightful contributions. Couldn't have delivered the event without you. I've learnt a lot. Hopefully the delegates all have, and others from NALC on the call. Please do fill out your feedback form when it appears on your screen. So it should just appear just as you're about to leave Zoom. Our post-event mailing for delegates will go out by the end of this week, by the end of Friday, and will include the chat and Dan's and Polly's slide decks, which were brilliant. So there'll be embedded hyperlinks, which you can just click on to access. Again, a thanks to CCLA, BHIB and Blashier for kindly sponsoring all of our online events and helping us keeping them going. And don't forget to check out NELC's online events program for events coming up through the rest of the autumn and the winter. Other than that, at 12 minutes past 1, just to say a huge thanks to you all. Do continue to engage with NELC's online events, and we're about to be launching, hopefully before Christmas, our annual conference and our online events as well for the full financial year next year, and including, I added as before, a social media online event as well. So do keep an eye out for that. But thanks for coming, and take care all.